Welcome, listeners, to Tales by Imon. My name is Ethan, and the story I'm about to tell you is one that I'm still trying to fully comprehend. It began on a quiet, unassuming street in suburban Ohio, the kind of place where the biggest news is usually a new family moving in or the annual bake sale. My life was as predictable as the mailman's route. I work from home as a graphic designer, which means my window is my primary connection to the outside world during the day. And my world, for the most part, consisted of the neat, identical houses across the street and the one directly to my left, the old gable house, home to Mr. Alistair Finch. Mr. Finch was a creature of habit. An elderly man, probably in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and a perpetual stoop. He lived alone. Every morning at 7 a.m., he'd retrieve his newspaper from the porch. Every Tuesday at 9 a.m., his lawn service would arrive. Every evening, just as the streetlights flickered on, a single warm light would illuminate his living room window. He was a quiet fixture of the neighborhood, a man who faded into the background, as reliable and unremarkable as the oak tree on his front lawn. We'd exchange polite nods if we happened to be outside at the same time, but that was the extent of our interaction. He was just the old man next door. Or so I thought. My obsession began on a Tuesday. I was staring out my office window, procrastinating on a design project, when my eyes drifted over to Mr. Finch's house. I'd seen that house 1,000 times, its faded blue siding and perfectly maintained gardenias. But that day, for the first time, I noticed something that was fundamentally wrong. It was a window. On the second floor, on the side of his house that faced my own, there were 3 windows. 2 of them belonged to what I assumed were bedrooms. But the third one, the one closest to the back of the house, was the problem. It was a perfectly normal, 6-pane window, identical to the others. But as I mentally mapped out the interior of his house, a layout almost identical to my own, I realized there was no room there for that window to exist. The master bedroom was at the front of the house. The guest bedroom was next to it. After that should be the master bathroom, whose small frosted window was on the back of the house. This third window was located on a solid stretch of wall that, in my house, was simply the shared wall between the guest room and the bathroom. It didn't make any sense. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe the layout was different. Maybe it was a strange architectural quirk, a window for a walk-in closet or a hallway. But the thought burrowed into my mind like a splinter. Over the next few days, I found myself constantly looking over at it. I'd watch the sun glint off its glass in the morning and see it darken into a black square at dusk. No light ever came from it. No curtains were ever drawn. It was a dead eye, staring blankly at my own house. My curiosity started to feel less like a casual observation and more like a nagging obsession. I started paying closer attention to Mr. Finch. His routines, which once seemed comforting in their predictability, now felt suspicious. Why did he never use a lawn service for the small patch of grass on the side of the house with a strange window? He meticulously tended to that small section himself, by hand, every weekend. Why did he always park his old sedan in a way that slightly obscured the view of that part of the house from the street? The turning point came about 2 weeks after my initial discovery. A delivery truck, unmarked and plain white, pulled up to Mr. Finch's house. This was unusual. He got groceries delivered sometimes, but this was a different kind of vehicle. Mr. Finch met the driver at the curb and signed for a series of large, flat, square boxes. From my vantage point, I couldn't see any labels, but I saw how he handled them. He didn't carry them with the casualness of someone who'd ordered a new bookshelf. He moved with a kind of hurried secrecy, his eyes darting around the street. He refused the driver's offer of a hand truck, instead carrying each heavy-looking box himself, not through the front door, but through the side gate that led to a small door on the side of the house, the very side with the phantom window. I watched, my heart thumping, as he disappeared with the last box. My mind raced with possibilities. What was in those boxes? They were about the right size and shape for soundproofing panels. The kind you'd use for a home recording studio. Or for something else. Something you didn't want anyone to hear. That's when the simple explanation I had clung to, that it was just an architectural oddity, shattered completely. An old man living alone doesn't suddenly decide to soundproof a non-existent room. The quiet, harmless Mr. Finch was hiding something. There was a space in that house that wasn't on any standard blueprint, a space he was actively concealing and now, apparently, fortifying. The politeness I felt towards my neighbor was replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The question was no longer if there was a secret room. The question was what, or who, was inside it. That night, I couldn't work. I couldn't even watch TV. I just sat in the dark, looking at the black, empty square of that window, and I knew that my quiet, predictable life on this quiet, unassuming street was over. I had to find out what was going on in Mr. Alastair Finch's house. I had to know what was in that secret room. And I had a terrible feeling that once I found out, I would wish I hadn't. The county assessor's website was a relic from the early 2000s, a clunky interface that tested my patience. But after an hour of navigating broken links and confusing menus, I found it. Scanned copies of the original development plans for our entire neighborhood, dating back to the late 1970s. I located Mr. Finch's property lot and clicked on the floor plan. My screen filled with a grainy, black and white image of his house's second floor. And there it was, in stark, official lines. Or rather, there it wasn't. The blueprint confirmed my suspicions with chilling certainty. It showed the master bedroom at the front, the guest bedroom in the middle, and the bathroom at the back. The wall that faced my house, the wall with the phantom window, was depicted as a single, unbroken line. There was no room, no closet, no architectural feature of any kind that could account for a window. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a mistake in my memory. It was a mistake in the house itself. A deliberate, physical lie. Seeing the proof on the screen shifted something inside me. This was no longer a quirky neighborhood mystery. It was a deception. An intentional, constructed secret. My surveillance, which had started as a casual curiosity, now felt justified. Necessary, even. The next morning, I dug out an old pair of binoculars from a box in the garage, a remnant from a birdwatching phase I'd had in college. I felt a pang of guilt as I raised them to my eyes from the relative safety of my office, like I was violating some sacred, unspoken suburban treaty. But the guilt was quickly overshadowed by the need to know. Through the lenses, the window just became a bigger version of the same enigma. The glass was slightly grimy, reflecting the sky and the leaves of the oak tree. I could see no movement, no shadows, no hint of a light fixture or a piece of furniture within. It was just a dark, impenetrable void. I spent hours over the next few days watching, hoping to catch a flicker of something, a brief reflection from inside, anything. Nothing. The window remained lifeless. The soundproofing panels he'd carried inside were my next focus. If the room was soundproofed, it meant there was a sound he didn't want his neighbors, specifically me, to hear. One night, driven by a new wave of resolve, I did something I never would have imagined myself doing a month ago. I slipped out my back door after midnight, crept through my own yard, and stood by the wooden fence that separated my property from Mr. Finch's. The air was cool and still. The only sounds were the chirp of crickets and the distant hum of the highway. I held my breath, straining to hear anything from the other side. A voice, a television, the hum of machinery. I heard only silence. A deep, profound, absolute silence that was somehow more unsettling than a scream would have been. It was the heavy, insulated quiet of a vacuum. The soundproofing was clearly effective. Whatever was happening in that room was being perfectly contained. I stayed there for 20 minutes, a silent sentinel in the dark, before the sheer creepiness of my own actions sent me back inside, my heart pounding in my chest. A week went by. Nothing changed. Mr. Finch continued his unwavering routine, and the window continued its silent watch. I was starting to feel like I was going crazy, building a conspiracy out of thin air. Maybe there was a rational explanation for all of it. Maybe he was a rare book collector, and the room was a climate-controlled, soundproofed vault to protect his investment. It seemed plausible. It was boring, but plausible. I was almost ready to let it go. And then I saw the electrician's van. It was a Thursday afternoon. A plain white van, much like the delivery truck from before, was parked in Mr. Finch's driveway. A man in a blue work uniform was talking to Mr. Finch on the porch. This wasn't strange in itself. Old houses need electrical work. But I noticed the man wasn't carrying a simple toolkit. He and Mr. Finch went to the side of the house, the side with the window, and I watched through my binoculars as they spoke, pointing at the wall and then at the main power meter. The electrician was there for hours. When he finally left, I waited until Mr. Finch went back inside, and then I looked again, my stomach twisting into a knot. There was something new on the wall. Running from the main electrical box near the ground, all the way up the blue siding to a spot just below the phantom window, was a brand new, thick, industrial-grade metal conduit. It was the kind of heavy-duty wiring you'd install for a workshop with powerful machinery, or a server room, or something that required a massive, dedicated draw of electricity, far more than a normal bedroom or a book vault would ever need. It was a definitive, physical clue, and it erased all my mundane theories. You don't install a dedicated, high-capacity power line to a non-existent room for a hobby. The room wasn't just a hidden space anymore. It was alive. It was consuming power, and enough of it to require its own special connection to the grid. My neighbor didn't just have a secret room. He had an operation. And whatever he was doing in there, it required two things: total silence and a whole lot of electricity. Silence and power. The two words echoed in my head for days, a mantra of my growing obsession. I tried to assemble the pieces into a coherent picture. An elderly, solitary man. A phantom window on a non-existent room. The delivery of soundproofing panels. And now, a dedicated, industrial-strength power line. My mind cycled through a dozen different theories, each more unlikely than the last. My first thought was a cryptocurrency mining operation. I'd read about them, rows and rows of powerful computers solving complex equations, generating a huge amount of heat and noise, and consuming a terrifying amount of electricity. It fit the evidence. The soundproofing would muffle the constant hum of the machines, and the new power line would be essential to run them without blowing every fuse in the house. It was a logical, modern-day explanation for a secret operation. But it didn't feel right. There was a cold, methodical precision to everything Mr. Finch did that didn't align with the chaotic image of a crypto miner. He was a man of routine and quiet dignity. It was hard to picture him managing a volatile, high-tech venture. And more than that, it just felt too simple. Too boring. The mystery of the house felt bigger, stranger than that. I knew I couldn't get any more information by just watching from my window. Looking gave me the window. Listening gave me the silence. Observing from afar gave me the power line. I had exhausted the limits of passive surveillance. To learn more, I had to get closer. I had to find a way to measure what was happening inside that room without ever setting foot in it. The new electrical conduit was my best lead. A massive power draw creates more than just heat. It creates an electromagnetic field, or EMF. Late one night, fueled by coffee and a dangerous level of curiosity, I found what I was looking for online. A handheld, digital EMF meter. It was the kind of device ghost hunters used on TV, but it was also a legitimate scientific instrument for detecting radiation from power lines, cell phones, and other electronics. If there was a massive amount of electricity being channeled into that room, this device would be able to detect it, even from my side of the fence. If I couldn't see inside, and I couldn't hear inside, maybe I could get a sense of the energy pouring out. I ordered one with next day shipping. The box arrived the following afternoon in a plain brown wrapper. Holding the device in my hand felt like crossing a new threshold. It was black and rectangular, with a small digital screen and a single button. It felt cold, professional, and slightly ominous. I was no longer just a nosy neighbor, I was an investigator with a tool. I waited until well after 1 a.m., when the entire street was dark and silent. I put on dark clothing, my heart thudding with a mixture of fear and excitement. I slipped out the back door, the EMF meter clutched in my hand, and crept once more to the fence line. I switched it on. The screen glowed with a soft green light, displaying a baseline reading of 1.5 milligauss. Normal background radiation. I took a deep breath and held the meter over the fence, pointing it toward Mr. Finch's house. The number stayed the same. I moved slowly along the fence, my feet making soft sounds on the damp grass. As I got closer to the part of the yard that ran alongside the secret room, the numbers on the screen began to tick upward. 2.7, 4.5, 9.8. A low, quiet hum started to emanate from the device. I was 20 feet away from the wall of his house, and the reading was already 10 times the normal background level. My breath caught in my throat. I crept forward, leaving the safety of my own yard and stepping onto the edge of his perfectly manicured lawn, hiding in the deep shadow cast by a large maple tree. I was now only a few feet from the wall, directly beneath the phantom window. I held up the meter. The numbers didn't just climb, they flew. 50, 120, 250. The quiet hum from the meter escalated into a frantic, high-pitched beeping. The reading finally settled around 350 milligauss, a level of electromagnetic radiation that was wildly, impossibly high. This was not a computer farm. This was the kind of reading you might get standing directly under a high-voltage power pylon. And then, a light flicked on. It wasn't in the secret room. It was the window right next to it, the guest bedroom. A yellow square of light suddenly cut through the darkness, illuminating the lawn around me. I froze, my body rigid with sheer panic. I threw myself to the ground, pressing into the damp earth behind the trunk of the maple tree. The beeping from the EMF meter sounded as loud as a fire alarm in the dead quiet of the night. I fumbled with the button, shutting it off. I saw a silhouette in the illuminated window. It was Mr. Finch. He stood there for a long moment, looking out into his yard, almost directly at where I was hiding. I was sure he'd seen me. I was sure it was all over. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. But he just stood there, a dark shape against the light, unmoving. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and the light clicked off, plunging the yard back into darkness. I didn't move for 10 minutes. I just lay there, the smell of wet soil filling my nostrils, my mind reeling. When I finally found the courage to crawl back to my own yard, I was shaking. It wasn't just the fear of being caught. It was the reading on the meter. That wasn't normal energy. It was something else entirely. Something that powerful, that concentrated. It was unnatural. Back in my house, I locked the door and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The pieces were no longer fitting into any logical puzzle I could conceive of. This wasn't about hiding a crime or a business. This felt different, bigger. This was about containing a phenomenon. My quiet, elderly neighbor hadn't just built a secret room. He'd built a machine. Sleep didn't come easily that night, or for many nights after. The image of Mr. Finch's silhouette in the window was burned into my mind. Every creak of my house, every shadow that danced on the wall, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I felt exposed. My office, once my sanctuary, now felt like a glass box. I started keeping the blinds mostly closed, only peering through a small slat when I felt the compulsive need to check on the house next door. My actions had consequences, and the close call in his yard was a stark reminder that I wasn't just observing a mystery. I was encroaching on a secret someone was working very hard to keep. The fear, however, didn't extinguish my curiosity. It refined it. I knew I couldn't risk another late-night expedition. Direct observation was now too dangerous. If I was going to find out what was happening in that house, I needed to change my approach. I had been so focused on the what, the room, the power, the energy field, that I had neglected the most important question, the who. Who was Alistair Finch, really? If the room was a locked box, then Mr. Finch was the key. My investigation moved from my window to my keyboard. I started with the basics: Google, social media, public records. The results were unnervingly sparse. There was no Facebook profile, no LinkedIn page, no Twitter account. Public records showed his name as the owner of the house, purchased in 1981, but little else. No listed family members, no recent permits filed with the city, other than for basic plumbing work a decade ago. For all intents and purposes, in the digital world, Alistair Finch was a ghost. In this day and age, having almost no online footprint is a louder statement than having a massive one. It's a deliberate act of erasure. I dug deeper, spending hours navigating online newspaper archives and public information databases. I searched for his name linked with different towns, different professions. Nothing. It was as if his life began the day he bought that house. It was frustrating, a series of digital dead ends that only made the mystery more profound. I was about to give up for the night when a new idea struck me. I had been searching for the man he was now. What about the man he was before? I opened a new search tab and connected to a network of academic journals and university archives. It was a long shot, but I had to try. I typed in Alistair Finch and added a single word, physics. I scrolled through pages of irrelevant results until one link, buried deep on the 8th page, caught my eye. It was a link to a scanned PDF document from a 1979 issue of the Journal of Advanced Theoretical Physics. The title of the article was A Practical Approach to Subdimensional Resonance and Energy Transference. The author was listed as Dr. Alistair Finch, Northgate Polytechnic Institute. My heart hammered against my ribs. I clicked the link. A grainy, scanned page materialized on my screen. There was a black and white photo of the author, a young man with intense, dark eyes, a sharp jawline, and a full head of dark hair. He looked nothing like the stooped, elderly man next door, but the fierce intelligence in his eyes was unmistakable. It was him. I devoured the article. It was dense, filled with complex equations and scientific jargon that went mostly over my head, but I understood the gist of it. Dr. Finch wasn't just studying physics, he was pushing its absolute limits. He was writing about theories that sounded like they were pulled from science fiction, the idea that different dimensions coexist with our own, separated by vibrational membrane. He theorized that by creating a focused, high-frequency energy field, one could essentially thin this membrane, allowing for the observation of, and potentially the transfer of energy or matter from, these other dimensions. The article was brilliant, but the editor's note at the end was what truly shook me. It mentioned that Dr. Finch's research was highly controversial. It was a follow-up to a research grant that had been terminated by the university. I searched for more articles, this time referencing the university and his name. I found a single, short news clipping from a 1980 university paper. The headline read, "Finch Project Halted Due to Safety Concerns." The article detailed how the university board had pulled funding from Dr. Finch's research, citing unstable energy fluctuations and a lack of reproducible, safe results. One anonymous source from the physics department was quoted as saying, "Alistair is a genius, but he's trying to knock on a door that humanity has no business opening." Everything clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The secret room wasn't for a crypto farm or a criminal enterprise. It was a private laboratory. The soundproofing wasn't to hide noise, it was to contain the vibrations of his machine. The dedicated power line wasn't for computers, it was to generate the immense energy field his theories required. The impossible EMF reading I had gotten wasn't a glitch, it was the direct signature of his experiment. The stooped, quiet neighbor who manually clipped the grass on the side of his house was the same man who had once tried to peel back the layers of reality. He hadn't given up when the world told him to stop. He had simply disappeared, bought a nondescript house in a quiet Ohio suburb, and continued his life's work. He had spent the last 40 years, in secret, finishing the work that the world had been too afraid to let him start. And I was living next to the laboratory. Knowing the truth was so much worse than not knowing. Before, the secret room was a puzzle, an intriguing mystery that occupied the quiet corners of my life. Now, it was a threat. A constant, low-grade hum of anxiety thrummed beneath my daily routine. Every time the lights in my house flickered, my heart would leap into my throat. Every unexpected noise from next door would make me freeze. I was living on the edge of a discovery that no one else in the world knew about, and the weight of that knowledge was crushing. Dr. Alistair Finch, the reclusive genius. For 40 years, he had been working in solitude, chipping away at the very foundations of physics in his suburban home laboratory. The article had mentioned unstable energy fluctuations. What did that mean in practice? Was I living next to a ticking time bomb? The thought was paralyzing. For a week, I did nothing. I buried myself in work, kept the blinds shut, and tried desperately to pretend that my biggest problem was a client who couldn't decide on a color palette. But you can't unknow something so monumental. The house next door was no longer just a house, it was a containment vessel. And one rainy Wednesday night, I learned that the containment was not perfect. I was trying to watch a movie, a mindless action flick to drown out my thoughts, when it began. The lamp on my end table flickered once, then twice. I paused the movie, my senses on high alert. The lights in the kitchen buzzed erratically, then dimmed to a dull orange glow before surging back to full brightness. My laptop screen suddenly filled with a blizzard of digital snow, and the Wi-Fi router began blinking a frantic, panicked orange. A deep, resonant hum started, so low it was more of a feeling than a sound. It vibrated up through the floorboards, through the soles of my feet, and settled deep in my chest. It was a physical presence, a pressure on the air around me. I scrambled to the office window, my hands shaking as I parted the blinds. The entire street was affected. Porch lights and street lights were strobing in a chaotic, unsynchronized rhythm, casting dancing, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. But Mr. Finch's house was the epicenter. While the lights on his porch flickered like all the others, a new light was visible from the phantom window. It wasn't a light bulb. It was a soft, violet pulse, a ghostly aurora that seemed to breathe. It would glow from within, staining the darkness a pale, sickly purple for a second, then fade back into blackness. It pulsed in time with the bone-deep hum that was vibrating through my house. This was it. The machine was on. I was witnessing one of the unstable energy fluctuations firsthand. The sight was both terrifying and hypnotically beautiful. The event lasted for maybe 2 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The deep hum vanished. The lights on the street stabilized. The violet glow in Mr. Finch's window was gone. Everything was normal again, shrouded in the quiet darkness of a rainy suburban night. A moment later, I saw front doors opening. Mr. Henderson from across the street. The Miller family 2 doors down. They gathered on their porches, looking up and down the street in confusion, their voices carrying through the damp air. Did your power do that? Must be a transformer problem. They had no idea. They saw a power surge. I saw a tear in the fabric of reality. I let the blinds fall back into place, my forehead slick with a cold sweat. The abstract danger from a 40-year-old news clipping was no longer abstract. It was real, and it was happening right next door. The next morning was trash day. As I wheeled my own bins to the curb, I saw Mr. Finch doing the same. He looked more tired than usual, his movements slower, more deliberate. He gave me his usual polite, almost imperceptible nod, and I returned it, my throat too tight to offer a good morning. After he went back inside, I let my gaze drift to his trash bin. The lid was slightly ajar. Against my better judgment, my feet carried me across the wet asphalt of the street. I glanced around. No one was watching. With a surge of nervous energy, I lifted the lid of his bin. It was mostly filled with normal household trash, newspapers, food cartons. But on top, there was a small cardboard box filled with something else. I reached in and pulled out a piece of what was inside. It was a tangle of copper wiring, blackened and brittle, as if it had been subjected to an intense, immediate burst of energy. I saw ceramic insulators cracked in half, their white surfaces scorched with strange, branching patterns like miniature lightning strikes. I pulled out a small metal box, the kind that might house a complex fuse or a circuit board. It was warped, its surface bubbled as if it had been flash melted from the inside out. This was the debris from last night. The machine wasn't just running, it was burning itself out, consuming its own components in whatever reaction it was creating. This wasn't a stable, controlled experiment. It was a violent, chaotic process that required constant, frantic repair. I dropped the melted box back into the bin and hurried back to my own house, my mind racing. The situation had changed, drastically. This wasn't just about a secret. It was about an immediate, physical danger. The machine was unstable, and Mr. Finch, an elderly man working all alone, was struggling to control it. Who do you call to report something like this? The police. The fire department. Hello, yes, I believe my reclusive neighbor, who is secretly a disgraced theoretical physicist, is running an interdimensional energy experiment in a hidden room in his house, and I think it might be about to explode. They would think I was insane. I was completely and utterly alone with this knowledge. And as I stood in my kitchen, looking at the quiet blue house next door, I was struck by a terrifying realization. If something was going to be done, I might be the only person who could do it. The realization that I was the only person who could do something was not empowering. It was terrifying. I felt like the sole, unwilling guardian of a secret that could either rewrite science or erase a city block. I am a graphic designer. I create logos and websites. I am not equipped to handle a rogue physicist who might be tampering with the laws of the universe in his spare bedroom. For days, I was paralyzed by indecision. Every option seemed to lead to a disastrous outcome. If I did nothing, the machine could fail catastrophically. If I did something, I could provoke a man I knew nothing about, a man who had gone to extraordinary lengths to remain hidden. Action without information was just recklessness. I realized I couldn't make a decision until I understood more about the machine's behavior. The event I had witnessed felt chaotic, but was it random? Or was there a pattern? I needed data. My approach to the mystery shifted once again. I became a scientist of sorts, with a sample size of 1. My office window became my observation post. Every night, I would sit in the dark, my EMF meter on the desk beside me, and I would watch and wait. I started a log in a new notebook, marking down the date, time, and any unusual readings or observations. The first few nights were uneventful. The EMF readings held steady at their normal, low background level. Mr. Finch's house remained dark and silent. Then, on the third night after the major event, it happened again. It was just after 2 a.m. The needle on my EMF meter began to twitch. The reading climbed slowly at first, then more rapidly. I looked out the window. The streetlights began to flicker. And then the hum started, that same deep, resonant vibration that I could feel in my bones. I looked at the phantom window and saw it, the soft, pulsing violet light. It lasted for exactly 90 seconds this time. I timed it on my phone, and then it stopped. The EMF reading dropped back to normal. The hum faded. The light vanished. I recorded it all in my log. 3 nights later, at almost the exact same time, it happened again. This time, it lasted for 2 minutes. Another entry in the log. A clear pattern was emerging, a 3-day cycle. The machine was being activated, or was activating itself, every 72 hours or so, for a very short duration. This wasn't random. It was methodical. The short bursts suggested a process that was either incredibly draining on his power supply or too unstable to run for long periods. Each activation was a carefully controlled, and likely dangerous, risk. This new knowledge did little to calm my nerves. In fact, it made things worse. I now had a schedule for my anxiety. Every third day, my evening would be spent with a knot in my stomach, waiting for the hum, waiting for the light, and praying that this time wouldn't be the time it all went wrong. The proof that things were already going wrong came not from my meter, but from my own backyard. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and I was trying to do something aggressively normal, weeding my flower beds. As I worked my way along the fence I shared with Mr. Finch, I noticed a patch of my marigolds looked sickly. The flowers nearest to the fence were withered and brown, while the ones just a few feet away were perfectly healthy. I leaned in for a closer look. They weren't just dead from lack of water or too much sun. The petals were curled and brown, but strangely damp, and a weird, silvery sheen coated the leaves, like a chemical burn. I followed the line of decay. It was a perfect arc, radiating out from the side of Mr. Finch's house, from the exact location of the secret room. The grass in the arc was yellowed and thin. The leaves on the lower branches of my maple tree were spotted and brittle. The energy from his machine, the intense electromagnetic field, was leaking. It was poisoning the ground. It was toxic to living things. The danger was no longer contained within his four walls. It was seeping, invisibly, into my own. That was the moment my fear was finally overcome by a sense of urgent responsibility. This couldn't continue. I couldn't just sit here and log the data while my yard died, waiting for something worse to happen. I had to intervene. But how? Confronting him was out of the question. He was a man who had built a wall of secrecy around himself for 40 years. He wouldn't react well to a neighbor showing up on his doorstep. I needed to send a message. A quiet, undeniable signal that said, "I know." A message that might, just maybe, open a door to communication instead of conflict. I thought of the box of burnt-out parts I'd seen in his trash. That was the key. That night, on the third night of the cycle, I waited. The hum started at 2:14 a.m. The violet light pulsed. It lasted 105 seconds. After it stopped and the street was quiet again, I put on a pair of gloves, went to my garage, and found the small melted metal box I had retrieved from his trash bin that morning and hidden. It felt heavy in my hand, a piece of a puzzle I was never meant to see. With my heart pounding, I walked out my front door, across my lawn, and up Mr. Finch's driveway. The air was still and cool. Every step felt momentous. I knelt down and placed the warped, melted piece of his machine squarely on his welcome mat, directly in front of the door. I didn't knock. I didn't make a sound. I just left it there, a silent accusation, a question, a plea. As I retreated back into the shadows of my own home, I looked back at the small, dark object sitting on his porch. I had made my move. The ball was in his court now, and I had no idea if he would return it with a conversation or a catastrophe. The hardest part was the waiting. After retreating into my house, I felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. I had crossed a line, a tangible boundary of property and privacy, and there was no going back. I spent the rest of the night in my office chair, not even trying to sleep, just watching the dark shape of Mr. Finch's house, waiting for a response. Would a light flick on? Would he emerge from his front door? Would the police show up? Nothing. The house remained as still and silent as a tomb. The sun rose, painting the sky in pale shades of orange and pink, and still, there was nothing. My adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving behind a jittery, caffeine-fueled exhaustion. Then, at 7 a.m., right on schedule, the front door opened. Mr. Finch stepped out onto his porch to retrieve his newspaper. This was it. I had my binoculars raised, my hands unsteady. I watched as he bent down, his movements as slow and deliberate as always. He picked up the folded newspaper, and then he saw it. It wasn't a dramatic, theatrical reaction. It was something much quieter and far more chilling. He simply froze. For a full 3 seconds, his body was completely still, his hand hovering over the welcome mat where the small, melted box lay. It was a microscopic pause, one that anyone else would have missed, but to me, watching with hyper-focused attention, it was a seismic event. Slowly, he straightened up. He didn't look down at the box again. Instead, his head lifted, and he began to scan the street. It was a slow, methodical sweep. His gaze passed over the Hendersons' house, the Millers, the empty street itself, and then it came to my house. It lingered there for a moment, on the second-floor window where I was hidden. I felt a jolt, as if he could see right through the walls, right through the darkness of my room, and was staring directly into my eyes. Then, his gaze moved on. He knelt down again, picked up the melted piece of his machine with one hand and the newspaper with the other, turned, and walked back inside. The door clicked shut. The silence that followed was louder than any accusation. He knew. He might not be certain it was me, but he knew someone was watching. Someone knew enough to retrieve a piece of his experiment from his trash and leave it as a calling card. I had prodded the beast, and now it was awake. For the next 2 days, an unnerving quiet settled over our little stretch of the street. Mr. Finch's routine didn't change, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The polite, distant space between our houses now felt charged with a tense, unspoken current. I felt like I was being watched, even when he wasn't outside. Every time I walked past a window, I half expected to see him staring back. The paranoia was suffocating. My home, my sanctuary, was beginning to feel like a cage. On the third day, the day the machine was due to activate again, his response came. It was late afternoon. I was at my desk, trying and failing to focus on work, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Mr. Finch was outside, dragging an extension ladder from his garage to the side of his house. My curiosity piqued. I grabbed my binoculars. He positioned the ladder directly below the guest room window, just a few feet away from the phantom window. He climbed up with a small toolbox and a cardboard box. I watched, my brow furrowed, as he began drilling into the wooden siding. What was he doing? Repairing something? After a few minutes, he pulled an object from the box. It was small, white, and dome-shaped. My blood ran cold as I recognized it. It was a security camera. My hands tightened on my binoculars. I watched as he carefully mounted the camera to the side of his house. He fed a wire through a small hole he had drilled and connected it. Then, he performed the final adjustment. He swiveled the camera on its mount, aiming the lens. He wasn't pointing it down at his yard for security. He wasn't pointing it towards the street. He aimed it up, across the property line, directly at my office window. He stayed there for a moment, making a final minute adjustment, ensuring the angle was perfect. It felt like he was a sniper zeroing in his scope. There was no mistaking the intention. This was his answer to my message. He hadn't confronted me. He hadn't called the police. He had done something far more effective. He had turned my own strategy against me. It was a declaration, a shield and a sword in one. You are being watched. He climbed down the ladder, packed up his tools, and went back inside without a single glance in my direction. I lowered my binoculars, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. I looked at the little white dome, the black, unblinking eye of the lens staring directly at me. My greatest advantage, my secret observation post, had been neutralized. More than that, it had been turned into a liability. He hadn't just blocked my view, he had invaded it. He had pushed back. The silent, one-sided conversation was over. A new, far more dangerous one had just begun. The camera was a declaration of war, and its first victim was my peace of mind. That small, white dome was a constant, oppressive presence. I found myself instinctively avoiding my own office, the room where I spent most of my life. I kept the blinds permanently shut, but it didn't matter. I could feel its unblinking gaze through the slats. He had successfully turned my sanctuary into a prison cell. Working became nearly impossible. My focus was shattered, my thoughts constantly drifting to the silent sentinel on the wall next door and the inscrutable old man who had put it there. The night after he installed, it was the third night of the cycle. I knew the machine would be activated. For the first time, I wouldn't be able to watch. The helplessness was infuriating. I sat in my living room, on the opposite side of the house, with the EMF meter on the coffee table in front of me. I was flying blind, relying on my one remaining sense. Right on schedule, at 2:19 a.m., the numbers on the meter began to climb. The familiar, deep hum vibrated through the house. I felt a pang of frustration, of being locked out of my own investigation. I could detect the energy, but I couldn't see the ethereal violet light. I couldn't witness the phenomenon. I just had to sit in the dark and imagine it. I watched the meter screen, and my stomach tightened. The reading climbed higher than it ever had before. It peaked at just over 400 milligauss, a new and terrifying record. Was he pushing the machine harder? Or was it becoming even more unstable? When it was over, the silence that returned felt heavier, more menacing than before. I spent the next day in a state of agitated frustration. He had me cornered. I was blind, and the danger was escalating. The dead patch of earth in my yard was a constant, ugly reminder of what was at stake. I couldn't back down. I couldn't just close my blinds and hope for the best. If my old method of surveillance was compromised, I needed a new one. My gaze fell upon my laptop, and an idea, a risky, invasive, and possibly illegal idea, began to form. If I couldn't look out, I would have to find another way to look over. 2 days later, another plain brown box arrived at my door. This one contained a drone. It wasn't a toy, it was a compact, high-end quadcopter, advertised for its whisper-quiet motors and a high-resolution camera that could stream 4K video. Most importantly, it had a secondary thermal imaging camera. If the machine was generating energy, it had to be generating heat. The thermal camera would see what the naked eye could not. The risk of being caught felt smaller than the risk of remaining blind. I waited for the next cycle, the next activation. The 3-day wait was agonizing. I spent the time practicing, flying the drone in my own backyard, getting a feel for the controls, learning its movements until I could maneuver it with confidence. The night of the test, a moonless, overcast sky provided the perfect cover. At 2 a.m., I went to my back porch, the drone and the controller in my hands. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This was a massive escalation. I was no longer a passive observer. I was now actively sending a probe into his airspace. I took a deep breath, and with a flick of my thumb, the drone lifted off the ground with a sound no louder than a swarm of dragonflies. I kept it low, navigating it around my own house until it was hovering above the street, a tiny, invisible spy in the night sky. On my phone screen, connected to the controller, the world was painted in the ghostly colors of thermal vision. My own house glowed a warm orange. The street was a cool blue. I navigated it slowly, carefully, across the invisible property line. I brought it to the side of Mr. Finch's house, my eyes glued to the screen. The wall of the house was a patchwork of cool blues and purples. Then, the machine started. I knew because the EMF meter I'd left on my desk started beeping faintly, and I could just barely feel the hum through the porch floor. On my screen, the phantom window, which was a cool, dark square a moment before, began to change. I expected to see a bloom of white heat. I was wrong. What I saw made the hair on my arms stand up. A perfect, razor-thin ring of blazing, white-hot energy appeared, outlining the window frame. It was the color of a welding arc, impossibly bright on the thermal scale. But the center, the window itself, was the opposite. It wasn't just cool, it was a void. A circle of the deepest, darkest purple imaginable, a color that on a thermal scale meant an impossible, absolute cold. It was a donut of blazing heat surrounding a core of unnatural, energy-devouring cold. It defied every law of thermodynamics I knew. I stared, mesmerized and horrified, when suddenly the video feed on my phone screen dissolved into a shrieking pattern of static. A warning flashed. Signal interference. Magnetic anomaly detected. The drone began to drift erratically, its quiet hum turning into a strained whine. The energy field was interfering with its electronics. Panic seized me. I jammed the controls, fighting to regain control. If it crashed in his yard, he would find it. He would know. The drone dipped, lurching towards his roof. I pulled back on the stick, and for a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, the connection re-established. I didn't hesitate. I flew it back as fast as I could, away from the house, away from the energy field. It landed with a clumsy thud on my lawn. I ran to it, retrieved it, and sprinted back inside, my lungs burning. I leaned against the door, panting, and looked at the controller in my hand. The video feed was gone, but the drone's onboard memory had automatically saved the last clear image it captured. I brought it up on the screen. It was the thermal image. The ring of fire, the heart of ice. My theory had been wrong. This wasn't a machine that just generated energy. It was a machine that was creating a hole. A window, not to a room, but to somewhere else. Somewhere cold. My brain, a machine built on logic and predictable physics, was trying to process an image that defied both. The thermal picture on my phone was a constant, looping nightmare in my thoughts. A ring of impossible heat, a core of impossible cold. It wasn't just an energy signature, it was a wound in the world. My conclusion from the night before no longer felt like a wild guess. It felt like an understatement. A hole, a window, a gateway. Whatever it was, Mr. Finch wasn't just generating energy, he was breaking open something that was meant to stay closed. I knew I had to go back to the source. The drone was too damaged for another flight near that energy field, and his camera was a permanent watchdog on my office. My investigation had to turn inward again, back to the only piece of solid information I had, Dr. Alistair Finch's research paper from 1979. I spent the next 2 days poring over that document, not just reading it, but dissecting it. This time, I wasn't just looking for the general theory. I was hunting for clues, for any phrase or equation that could explain the image on my phone. And on the second day, I found it. It was in a dense paragraph I had previously skimmed over, a section detailing the theoretical risks of his experiment. He wrote about the possibility of creating a null temperature event horizon if the resonance frequency was pushed beyond a certain threshold. He described it as a state in which energy is not merely absent, but actively and entropically nullified. He called it a zero-point energy sink, a core of absolute cold. The words on the 40-year-old paper were a perfect, chilling description of what I had seen. He had predicted this. He had known this was a possible outcome. The paper went on to warn that such a state would be unpredictably volatile, and its effects on the local dimensional membrane were entirely unknown. He hadn't just predicted it. He had built it. And according to his own warnings, he had no idea what it would actually do. My toolbox of senses felt incomplete. I had seen the light. I had measured the energy field. Now, I needed to know if it made a sound. The room was soundproofed, I knew that. But the energy I had witnessed, the violence of the reaction that was melting metal components, could any soundproofing truly contain that? And more importantly, if it was a window to somewhere else, was there any sound coming from the other side? My next purchase was a parabolic microphone, a large, clear dish with a sensitive microphone at its focus, capable of picking up distant sounds with remarkable clarity. It was my last resort, another step deeper into a dangerous obsession. On the next third night, I set up my new listening post not in my office, but in my downstairs guest room. The window was smaller and at a less direct angle, but it was out of the line of sight of Finch's camera. I sat in the dark, the dish pointed through the slightly open window, and placed the high-quality headphones over my ears. The world became an intimate landscape of sound, the gentle rustle of leaves, the distant rumble of a truck on the highway, the chirping of crickets. I had the EMF meter on the table next to me, my only visual cue. At 2:22 a.m., the cycle began. I saw the EMF reading start its climb. Through the headphones, I heard the machines hum, much clearer than before. It was a deep, electric, thrumming sound, like a massive transformer. But as the EMF reading soared past 300, a new sound began to bleed through. It was faint at first, a high-frequency static at the very edge of my hearing. But it grew, resolving itself into something layered and complex. It was not the sound of a machine. It was a dry, rhythmic, scraping sound, like stone grinding against stone. Beneath that was a sharp, crystalline clicking, like 1,000 tiny shards of glass chittering against each other. It was a sound that was fundamentally alien, a sound that no animal or machine on Earth would make. It was the sound of something else. I sat frozen, my knuckles white on the edge of the table, listening to this impossible sound emanating from the house next door. This wasn't just an energy field. It was a place. And something was in that place. The EMF reading peaked, holding steady at its new, dangerous high. The scraping and clicking continued, a steady, horrifying rhythm. And then, for just a fraction of a second, another sound cut through the static. It was a voice. Or the ghost of a voice. It was stretched and warped, distorted by the energy and the distance, but it was undeniably organic. It wasn't the alien clicking. It was a high-pitched, desperate, electronic shriek that was almost a word. It was garbled, but for one terrifying, heart-stopping moment, it sounded like it was trying to say, out. And then, silence. The machine powered off. The hum, the scraping, the clicking, the voice, it was all gone. The EMF meter dropped back to its baseline. All I could hear were the crickets. I ripped the headphones from my head as if they were on fire, my ears ringing. My breath came in ragged gasps. I stared at the dark house next door, my understanding of the situation tilting into a new and far more dreadful shape. It wasn't just an empty, cold somewhere else. Something was in there. Something intelligent. And it sounded like it wanted out. The word, or the ghost of a word, was out. It replayed in my head on a continuous, tormenting loop. It had stripped away the last remnants of scientific detachment I had. This was no longer an abstract phenomenon to be observed and measured. A voice changes everything. A voice implies intent, consciousness, a will. And with that comes a question that chilled me to my core. Was the voice a prisoner's plea, or a predator's demand? My perception of Mr. Finch fractured into a dozen terrifying possibilities. Was he a jailer, holding something captive in another dimension? Was he a foolish summoner, trying to communicate with something he couldn't control? Or was he, perhaps, a victim himself, a man who had opened a door he was now unable to close? The quiet, stooped old man had transformed in my mind into a figure of immense and unpredictable power. The camera on his house now seemed less like a warning and more like the watchful eye of a prison guard. I knew I had hit the absolute limit of what remote observation could tell me. I had a picture of the doorway and a sound from within, but I had no understanding of the man who held the key. The why had become more important than the what. Why was he doing this? Why risk everything, for 40 years, in total secrecy? To understand the machine, I realized I first had to understand its creator. My opportunity came unexpectedly 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning. It was not a machine night. It was just a normal day. But Mr. Finch broke his routine. Instead of tending to his garden after retrieving his newspaper, he walked to his garage, and a moment later, his old, meticulously maintained sedan backed out of the driveway. In the 4 years I had lived here, I had only ever seen him use that car for his weekly grocery run on Thursdays. This was a deviation. This was new data. It was a reckless, impulsive decision, But I was done with waiting for the mystery to come to me. I grabbed my keys and my phone, ran to my own car, and pulled out of my driveway, making sure to stay several cars behind him as he drove away from our neighborhood. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was a new level of violation, a new kind of insanity. I was actively stalking my neighbor. He wasn't a difficult man to follow. He drove slowly, cautiously, never exceeding the speed limit. We drove for 15 minutes, away from the commercial districts and into a quieter, older part of town, full of large oak trees and historic houses. He finally signaled a turn into the stone gateway of the Oakwood Memorial Cemetery. I parked my car across the street, my mind reeling. A cemetery? I watched as he got out of his car, holding a small bouquet of fresh carnations. He walked with his familiar stoop through the rows of weathered stone, a solitary figure in a quiet city of the dead. I reached into my glove box for my binoculars. This felt like the ultimate intrusion into a private moment, but I couldn't stop now. I focused the lenses, finding him standing before a modest, gray granite headstone. He knelt down, his old knees protesting the movement, and gently wiped some leaves from the face of the stone. He placed the carnations in a small, built-in vase. And then he just stayed there, on his knees, his head bowed. From my position, I couldn't read the inscription on the headstone clearly. But I watched him, and I saw his shoulders begin to shake in what I could only interpret as silent sobs. For the first time, I saw him not as a mysterious scientist or a potential threat, but as a man in profound pain. After a long while, he stood up, wiped his eyes with a handkerchief, gave the stone one last, lingering look, and walked slowly back to his car. I waited until his sedan was out of sight before I got out of my own car. A morbid, irresistible pull drew me across the street and through the gates. I found the headstone easily, the fresh, bright carnations a beacon among the older graves. I stood before it, and I read the inscription. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Eleanorfinch. Beloved wife. 1928 to 1980. My mind raced, connecting the dots with dizzying speed. The year. 1980. The university had pulled his funding in 1980. His wife had died in 1980. He had bought the house, our house's twin, in 1981. This entire 40-year endeavor, this secret life, this dangerous obsession, it hadn't begun with a scientific theory. It had begun with a broken heart. The distorted voice I had heard through the microphone echoed in my mind. The high-pitched, desperate sound. Was he trying to talk to something alien? Or was he trying to talk to her? The thought was staggering. He wasn't a monster. He was a widower. And his secret machine wasn't a weapon or a tool for pure discovery. It was a desperate, 40-year love letter written in the language of theoretical physics and unimaginable energy. The enemy I had been so terrified of had just been given a human heart. And as I stood there in the silent cemetery, I suddenly had no idea what I was supposed to do. Driving home from the cemetery, the world seemed fundamentally altered. The houses, the trees, the quiet suburban streets all looked the same, but the reality beneath them had been completely rewritten. Mr. Finch was no longer a faceless enigma, a mad scientist in a suburban lab. He was a grieving husband. My investigation, which had felt like a righteous, self-preservation-fueled quest for the truth, now felt like a vulgar intrusion into a private tragedy. The guilt was a heavy, bitter pill to swallow. But the new emotional complexity of the situation didn't negate the danger. In fact, it amplified it. I sat in my living room that evening, my logbook of data open on the table. The EMF readings, the thermal images, the dead patch of earth in my yard, that evidence was still real. The distorted voice pleading to get out was still a terrifying mystery. A man chasing a scientific theory might be reasoned with. But a man chasing a ghost? A man consumed by 40 years of unresolved grief? A man like that might burn down the world to feel the warmth of his wife's hand again. The motive made him more human, but it also, in a way, made him more dangerous. He had nothing left to lose. I was torn. My instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to find a way to stop him, to shut the machine down. But my newfound empathy recoiled at the thought of destroying the life's work of a man who had already lost everything. How could I be the one to extinguish his last, desperate hope? I couldn't fight him as an enemy. But maybe, just maybe, I could reach him as a person. The silent war of intimidation, the melted box, the camera, had led to a stalemate. I needed to send a new message, one that wasn't a threat, but an olive branch. A message that said, I know your secret, but I also know your pain. The carnations at the cemetery gave me the idea. That night, I drove to an all-night grocery store and bought a single, perfect, white carnation. It felt like a fragile, inadequate symbol for the complex message I was trying to send. I waited until after midnight, when the street was cloaked in its usual silence. I slipped out my door, my heart beating not with the frantic fear of a spy, but with the heavy trepidation of a diplomat on a delicate mission. I was careful to stay out of the camera's line of sight, approaching his house from the side and using the shadows of the large oak tree for cover. I walked quietly up his driveway and knelt at his front door. The welcome mat was old and worn. For a moment, I hesitated. This was an irreversible step. But the image of Mr. Finch, kneeling and broken at his wife's grave, pushed me forward. I gently placed the single white carnation on the mat, its stem pointing towards the door. Then, just as quietly, I retreated. The next morning, I was watching, not from my office, but from my downstairs living room window, which offered a partial, obscured view of his porch. At 7 a.m., the door opened. Mr. Finch stepped out. He bent down to get his paper and, just as he had with the metal box, he paused. But this was a different kind of pause. It was longer, deeper. He slowly straightened up, not with the paper, but with a single white flower in his hand. He stared at it, his knuckles white. Through my binoculars, I could see his expression. It wasn't the cold, calculating look I had seen before. It was a look of profound, soul-shaking shock. His emotional armor, so carefully maintained for 40 years, seemed to have been vaporized in an instant. His eyes lifted from the flower and locked onto my house. Not just the building, but directly at the living room window where I was hiding. It was as if he could feel my presence. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was a raw, vulnerable mixture of confusion, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. He stood there for what felt like a lifetime, the carnation held delicately in his trembling fingers. I expected him to go back inside, to retreat behind his walls and process this new violation. But he didn't. He took a slow, deliberate breath. Then he did the one thing I never, in all my wildest theories, had anticipated. He took a step off his porch. It was a violation of an unspoken treaty that had defined our relationship for years. He stepped onto the grass, the dew soaking his slippers. Then he took another step, and another, his eyes never leaving my house. He was walking across the lawn, the no-man's land that separated our two worlds, with a slow, inexorable purpose. He was coming for me. My blood turned to ice. I stumbled back from the window, my mind blank with panic. I heard his footsteps on my own driveway, then on my porch steps. And then, a sound that shattered the 40-year silence between our two houses. A sound that was both perfectly mundane and cosmically terrifying. Ding-dong. My doorbell. He was here. After all this time, he was at my door. The sound of the doorbell was an explosion in the quiet house. For a solid 10 seconds, I was paralyzed, my feet rooted to the floor. My mind, which had been racing with theories and plans for months, was now a complete and silent void. Every instinct screamed at me to hide, to pretend I wasn't home. But he knew. He had walked across the lawn with the deliberate purpose of a man who would not be ignored. There was no escape. Taking a shaky breath, I forced myself to move. Each step towards the front door felt like walking towards a cliff edge. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I turned it, pulled the door inward, and for the first time, came face to face with my neighbor, Alistair Finch. He was older and more fragile than he appeared from a distance. Up close, I could see the fine web of wrinkles around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. His eyes, though, were sharp and fiercely intelligent, and right now, they were filled with a profound, soul-deep weariness. In one hand, he held the white carnation I had left. In the other, he held the small, melted metal box I had left days before. He held them out slightly, not as accusations, but as evidence. "I believe," he said, and his voice was a dry, quiet rasp, like stones scraping together, as if it hadn't been used for proper conversation in years. "These belong to you." It wasn't a question. I swallowed, my throat suddenly desert dry. "Yes," I managed to say. "They do." An unbearable silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken questions. He looked past me, into my house, then back at me. "May I come in, mister?" He trailed off, realizing he didn't even know my name. "Ethan," I said, stepping back. "My name is Ethan. And yes, please." He walked past me into my entryway, and I closed the door, sealing us both inside. The quiet suburban world outside ceased to exist. There was only this small space, and the immense, dangerous secret that now filled it. He turned to face me, his gaze analytical, like a scientist studying an unexpected variable. "You are a very methodical observer, Ethan," he stated, his voice a little stronger now. "The window, the power line, the electromagnetic field, the sound. You've been very thorough. My heart hammered in my chest. He knew the full extent of my spying. I was worried, I stammered, feeling like a child caught doing something wrong. I saw the window didn't match the floor plan, and then I saw the components in your trash. I knew something was unstable. He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the carnation in his hand. And this? The trash, I understand. Scientific curiosity. But this is something else. How did you know about Eleanor? I followed you, I confessed, the shame hot on my cheeks. To the cemetery. I saw the headstone. I'm sorry. It was an invasion of your privacy, but I had to understand why. A flicker of something, pain, surprise, crossed his face. He sank down onto the small bench in my entryway, as if his legs could no longer support him. He stared at the flower, and for a moment, I saw not a brilliant physicist, but a tired, lonely old man. 45 years ago, he began, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor and I were working on the same theories at Northgate. She was a brilliant astrophysicist. More brilliant than I. She saw the universe not as a collection of rules, but as a piece of music. She believed that everything, space, time, matter, was a vibration, and that if you found the right frequency, you could tune it. You could create a resonance with other points in space-time, even other realities. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. Our work was theoretical, of course, until she got sick. It was fast. An aneurysm. One moment she was laughing at something on the television, and the next, she was gone. The music stopped. He paused, composing himself. I couldn't accept it. Science said her energy was still there, dispersed into the universe. I became convinced that if I could just build a machine powerful enough, if I could find her frequency, I could create that resonance. A bridge. Not just to talk, but to... His voice broke. To bring her back. Every piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My fear was replaced by a wave of profound sympathy. The voice, I said, my own voice hushed. The sound I heard, the one that said, out. Was it her? A shadow passed over Mr. Finch's face. The weary grief was replaced by a familiar look I had seen in my own mirror for months. Fear. I hope so, he said, his voice heavy with doubt. For 30 years, there was nothing but silence and failure. But in the last decade, as the power sources become more stable, I've made contact. I've heard things. At first, I was sure it was her. Whispers. Fragments. But lately, it's become less clear. The signal is contaminated. There is interference. It's like the bridge I built leads to her, but it passes through somewhere else along the way. Somewhere noisy and dark. He looked at me, the full weight of his 40-year burden in his eyes. The machine is becoming more powerful, but also more unstable. The activations are harder to control. What you saw, the melted components, the energy leaks, that is happening more and more. I am old, Ethan. I'm losing control of it. This was it. The confession. The validation of all my fears. He knew the danger better than I did. That is why I am here, he continued, standing up slowly. Your message, the flower, it told me you understood this was about more than just physics. I have been alone with this for 40 years. I can't be alone anymore. I need help. He took a step towards me. I need to show you, he said, his voice low and intense. You have seen the shadows and heard the echoes. Now you need to see the source. You need to understand what I'm dealing with. He looked at me, his old tired eyes boring into mine. Will you come? He asked. Will you come see my machine? The question hung in the air between us. For months, my singular obsession had been to get inside that secret room. Now, the door was being held open for me. He was offering me the key to the entire mystery. But I knew with absolute and terrifying certainty that once I stepped through his door, there would be no coming back. There was only one possible answer. To refuse his offer, to turn back now, would be a denial of every obsessive thought, every sleepless night, every ounce of fear and curiosity that had consumed me for months. It would be an act of cowardice I didn't think I could live with. I had started this. I had pushed and prodded until the secret had broken open. I had to see it through to the end. Yes, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'll come. A flicker of relief, so profound it was almost painful to watch, washed over Alistair Finch's face. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Thank you, he whispered. He turned without another word and opened my front door. I followed him out into the bright morning sun, which felt jarringly normal, and walked beside him across the manicured grass that separated our two lives. This short journey felt more significant than any trip I had ever taken. I was an astronaut stepping out of my landing craft onto the surface of an alien world. The inside of his house was like stepping into a photograph from 1980. It was immaculately clean, but everything, the floral patterned sofa, the dark wood coffee table, the rotary phone on a small end table, was from another era. The air was still and smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. On the mantelpiece, among a few old books, were several framed photos. A young Alistair with his arm around a beautiful, smiling woman with dark, intelligent eyes. Eleanor. In every photo, she was radiant, full of a life that made the silent, still house feel even more like a tomb. It was a shrine, and I was an intruder. "This way," he said, leading me up the carpeted stairs. The second floor was as quiet as the first. We walked down a short hallway, past a closed door I assumed was his bedroom, and another I knew was the guest room. We stopped in front of a large built-in bookshelf, filled with heavy volumes on physics, engineering, and mathematics. There was no door. He reached for a specific book, a thick tome titled Principles of Quantum Electrodynamics, and pulled it forward. It didn't come off the shelf. Instead, I heard a deep, satisfying clunk of heavy tumblers falling into place. With a soft groan of protest, the entire bookshelf swung inward, revealing a thick, steel door with a heavy, bank vault-style wheel for a handle. My phantom window was not for a room, it was for a fortress. He turned the wheel, and the heavy door hissed open. A wave of cool air washed over me, carrying a strange sterile scent like right after a thunderstorm, the smell of ozone and hot metal. "After you, Ethan," he said grimly. I stepped across the threshold, and my breath caught in my chest. The room was not what I expected. It wasn't a gleaming, futuristic laboratory. It was something far more raw, more real, more terrifying. The walls were covered in the thick, gray, foam soundproofing panels I had seen him carry inside. Thick, black power conduits snaked across the ceiling, all converging on the center of the room. And in the center was the machine. It wasn't one single object, but a dozen, all interconnected in a chaotic yet purposeful symphony of metal, wire, and glass. A massive, cylindrical copper coil, as thick as my arm, formed a ring about 10 feet in diameter. In the center of that ring, aimed at the phantom window, was a complex assembly of what looked like polished black crystal lenses, all focused on a single point in space. Banks of humming capacitors, some old and analog with large dials, others modern and digital, lined one wall. A tangle of wires, as thick as my wrist, connected everything to a central control console, a messy mix of a modern computer monitor and old, heavy-duty knife switches. It looked like something built over a lifetime, a beautiful, terrifying, homemade heart of a star. I was speechless, staring in awe and horror. I could feel the latent power in the room, a low thrum that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. "It's bigger than I imagined," I finally managed to say. "The resonance chamber requires a significant footprint," Finch explained, his voice taking on a detached, academic tone as he walked toward the control console. "The outer ring generates the primary electromagnetic field. The central lens array focuses it, creating the aperture. The aperture. The window. The hole." He pointed to a large, cylindrical component connected to the main copper coil, where I could see scorch marks and melted wiring. "The primary flaw in my design has always been power regulation. The energy required to create a stable resonance is immense, and it degrades the components. I've been replacing parts for years, but they're failing faster now. The fluctuations are getting stronger." He then walked me over to a workbench against the far wall. On it sat two objects. One was a device that looked like a complex capacitor, its metal housing warped and blackened, a perfect match for the piece I had left on his doorstep. Next to it was a brand new, identical-looking component, gleaming and pristine. "This is a resonance tuner," he said, gesturing to the new part. "It helps stabilize the field during the initial power surge. The last one, as you discovered, burned out completely. The next activation without a functioning tuner, well, the results would be unpredictable. At best, it would blow every fuse on the block. At worst." He didn't finish the sentence. He looked away from the machine and met my eyes, his own gaze filled with a desperate, terrifying sincerity. "I have the replacement part, but my hands, they're not steady enough for the delicate wiring anymore. And the installation must be done at a precise moment, at peak resonance, when the energy flow is momentarily balanced. It requires two people, one at the controls and one at the coil." My blood turned to ice. I knew what was coming next. "The next cycle is tomorrow night," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I need you to help me. I can guide you through it from the console, but you will have to be the one to make the connection." He was asking me to put my hands on the machine, to participate, to become an accomplice in his impossible, dangerous quest. He was asking me to help him knock on that door that the world had been too afraid to let him open. My living room, the cemetery, Mr. Finch's porch, those were all stages in a slow, creeping negotiation with a reality I didn't understand. But here, in the heart of the machine, the time for observation and quiet messages was over. This was a direct question, a demand for action. My mind raced, weighing the monumental, terrifying insanity of his request against the alternative. What happened if I said no? He would try to do it himself. He would fail. And the unpredictable results of an uncontrolled activation would become my reality, and the reality of everyone on this street, whether I was involved or not. It wasn't a choice between safe and dangerous. It was a choice between two different kinds of catastrophe. One where I stood by and watched it happen, and one where I at least had a hand on the wheel. I took a deep breath, the smell of ozone filling my lungs. "Okay," I said, the words sounding small and inadequate in the humming silence of the room. "Tell me what I need to do." A wave of profound relief washed over Alistair's face, so potent it seemed to momentarily erase the decades of grief etched there. "Thank you, Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He quickly composed himself, the scientist taking over once more. "The procedure is delicate. The activation sequence builds to a peak resonance state, a moment where the energy field is at its most powerful, yet paradoxically, at its most stable. It is a window. It lasts for approximately 15 seconds. In that window, the main power flow to the resonance tuner is momentarily balanced. That is when you must make the swap." He walked me over to the massive copper coil, and I could feel a faint warmth radiating from it, even while it was dormant. He pointed to the scorched, damaged tuner. "You will need to disconnect these two contact points, remove the burned-out unit, slot the new one into place, and reconnect the contacts. The fittings are simple clasps, but they will be stiff. You will need to be fast and firm." 15 seconds. It sounded like an eternity, and no time at all. "What happens if I'm too slow?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Alistair's expression was grim. "If you are still touching the unit when the window closes, the feedback surge will be catastrophic. For you, and for the machine." He didn't need to elaborate. I understood. Catastrophic meant lethal. He spent the next hour walking me through the procedure again and again. He gave me a set of heavy, insulated rubber gloves and the specific tools I would need. We did dry runs, my hands fumbling with the clasps on the damaged unit as he counted down from 15, his voice sharp and precise. Each practice run ended with my heart pounding, my palms sweating inside the thick gloves. Finally, he seemed satisfied. "That's all we can do to prepare," he said, his energy seeming to fade. "The rest depends on tomorrow night." I walked back to my own house in a daze. The world felt thin and unreal. My design projects on my computer screen seemed absurd, trivial artifacts from a life I no longer lived. I tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash. I looked at photos of my parents, my sister. What would they think if they knew what I was about to do? I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation, of being the only person on Earth aware of the specific, insane danger that was scheduled to occur in less than 24 hours. That afternoon, I did something I never thought I'd do. I opened a text document and wrote a letter. I didn't address it to anyone in particular. I just wrote down everything. About the window, about Alistair and Eleanor, about the machine, the energy readings, the voice, and the plan for that night. I saved the file to my desktop with a simple, clear name, "In case of emergency, read me." It was a morbid, desperate act, but the thought of disappearing without a trace, of this entire story vanishing with me, was unbearable. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep violet, a strange calm settled over me. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but the frantic panic had subsided. I had made my choice. I had a role to play. At 10 p.m., I put on a pair of sturdy boots, took a final look around my quiet, normal house, and walked outside. The air was cool and crisp. The stars were bright. I crossed the lawn to Alistair's house and knocked on the front door. He opened it immediately, as if he had been waiting right behind it. He was dressed in a simple, dark work coat, his face pale but his eyes resolved. He gave me a single solemn nod and led me inside, straight up the stairs and through the secret passage into the lab. The hum of the machine felt louder tonight, more expectant. The air was thick with tension. He handed me the insulated gloves and the tools. I walked to my position by the coil, my heart a slow, heavy drum. Alistair stood before the main console, his frail form silhouetted against the glow of the monitor. He began flipping a series of switches, and the hum in the room intensified, rising in pitch. He looked over his shoulder at me, his eyes locking with mine across the humming, dangerous space. "Remember," he said, his voice cutting through the rising noise. "The sounds can be distracting. When the aperture opens, you will hear things. Do not listen to them, Ethan. No matter what you hear, you must focus only on your task. Focus on the 15 seconds." I gave him a single tight nod, my throat too dry to speak. His hand, frail and spotted with age, moved to a large black lever on the console. The world seemed to shrink to this single, terrifying moment, a silent question passing between us. "Are you ready?" I braced myself. He took one final, deep breath and pulled the lever down. The moment Alistair pulled the lever, the room was born into a new kind of life. The low hum erupted into a deafening, rising crescendo. A high-pitched whine emanated from the capacitor banks, a sound that felt like it was trying to pry my teeth from my skull. A cascade of lights flashed to life on the console, and I could hear the sharp thump-thump-thump of heavy relays kicking into place somewhere behind the walls. "Power at 50%, Alistair shouted over the noise, his eyes glued to his monitors. "Field is beginning to form." I could see it. The air around the massive copper coil began to shimmer, like heat haze on a summer road. A tingling sensation spread across my skin, and the hair on my arms stood on end. The scent of ozone intensified, sharp and clean. 70%. Resonance is building. Hold your position, Ethan. My hands, slick with sweat inside the insulated gloves, tightened around the tools. I was standing less than 3 feet from the coil, and the warmth radiating from it was becoming an intense, oppressive heat. The phantom window, the one I had watched for so many months, was beginning to glow from the inside, casting a pulsing violet light into the room. 90%. Brace yourself. The shimmering air in the center of the ring coalesced. The light distorted, bent, and then seemed to fold in on itself, leaving a perfect circle of absolute, predatory blackness hanging in the air. It was a hole in the world, fringed with a halo of violent purple energy. And from that hole, the sound came. Alistair's warning did nothing to prepare me. The mechanical roar of the machine was instantly drowned out by a cacophony from the aperture. The dry, scraping, clicking sounds I had heard before were now a screeching wall of noise. It was a sound of alien angles and impossible biology. But piercing through it, like a needle through static, was the voice. "Alistair?" It was a whisper, distorted and faint, but it was the voice of a woman. It was filled with a desperate, heartbreaking loneliness. Alistair flinched at the console, his knuckles turning white. "Where am I?" "Alistair, please, help me." "The window is open." Alistair yelled, his voice strained. "Peak resonance. Go, Ethan. 15 seconds." The countdown began. I lunged forward, ignoring the whispers that were now pleading for my attention. My gloved fingers fumbled with the first clasp on the burnt-out tuner. It was scorching hot, the heat searing through the thick rubber. The clasp wouldn't budge. I put my full weight into it, and with a painful groan, it snapped open. "So cold, help." The voice cried. 13 seconds. I pulled at the second clasp. Beneath the woman's voice, I could hear something else now. A low, wet, guttural clicking. The interference he'd mentioned. It sounded hungry. The second clasp snapped open. I pulled the smoking, warped tuner from its housing. For a terrifying half-second, an arc of blue electricity leaped from the open port, striking the wall with a deafening crack. "Ethan!" The voice said my name. A cold dread, far colder than the fear of electrocution, washed over me. How did it know my name? "Focus!" Alistair screamed. 9 seconds. I grabbed the new tuner from my belt. It felt cool and heavy. I shoved it into the housing. It resisted, the fittings tight. I pushed, my muscles straining. The whispers were getting louder, more desperate, as if sensing the window was about to close. The guttural clicking was closer, too. "Don't leave me. Please, Ethan, don't." 5 seconds. "Get it seated." With a final, desperate shove, the tuner clicked into place. I grabbed the first clasp, my fingers clumsy with panic, and slammed it shut. 3. I grabbed the second clasp. 2. I slammed it down, the metal screeching in protest. It was done. 1. I threw myself backward, tumbling onto the floor just as Alistair shoved the main lever back up. The effect was instantaneous. The furious roar from the aperture was cut off by a new sound, a single piercing shriek of pure, inhuman rage that vibrated through the entire house. Then, with a sound like a giant camera shutter, the hole snapped shut. The violet light vanished. The roar of the machine spooled down into a whining hum, and then a ringing, profound silence fell over the room, broken only by the frantic sound of our own breathing. I lay on the floor, my chest heaving, my body trembling. I had done it. We had done it. Ethan! Alistair's voice was shaky. I pushed myself up. He was leaning heavily on the console, his face ashen, but his eyes were wide with a wild, triumphant light. He pointed to a small modern monitor that I hadn't noticed before, which now displayed a clean, perfect, green sine wave. It worked, he breathed, a disbelieving laugh escaping his lips. The tuner, it stabilized the signal. The interference is gone. It's clear. A sense of relief, so powerful it made me dizzy, washed over me. We had succeeded. We had fixed it. Alistair turned to me, his face a bizarre mask of joy and terror. I can hear her now, Ethan, he said, his voice trembling with an awe that chilled me to the bone. Her voice, it's perfectly clear. He leaned closer to a speaker on the console, listening to something I couldn't hear. His triumphant expression slowly melted away, replaced by a look of dawning, absolute horror. He stumbled back from the console, his eyes wide and locked on mine. We've made a terrible mistake, he whispered. That wasn't interference we filtered out. It was a warning. She's not asking for help. She's been screaming at me for 10 years to stay away. The ringing in my ears was so loud that for a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The triumphant adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins turned to ice water. I stared at Alistair, at his face drained of all color, and saw my own disbelief mirrored in his horrified eyes. What? I asked, my voice a raw croak. What do you mean, stay away? Stay away from what? Alistair didn't answer. He just pointed a trembling finger at the speaker on his console. With a tap on his keyboard, he played the audio he had isolated. The room, which a moment ago had been filled with the chaotic roar of the machine, was now filled with a sound far more terrifying, a voice of perfect, crystalline clarity. It was a woman's voice, laced with an ancient, weary panic. Alistair, if you can hear me, you have to stop. This place, it's not what you think. It's empty. It's cold. But not empty. There is something else here. It hunts in the dark, Alistair. It's drawn to the warmth, to the light. Your machine is a beacon. For 10 years, I've been whispering, trying to warn you without drawing its attention. You have to close the door. Forget me. Forget me. The message ended, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier and more suffocating than any noise. The voice wasn't a ghost. It was Eleanor, a real, terrified person, trapped on the other side of the universe, using her last ounces of energy not to beg for rescue, but to plead for him to abandon her. The truth crashed down upon Alistair with the force of a physical blow. His entire life's work, his 40-year vigil, the grief that had fueled his every waking moment, it had all been based on a terrible misinterpretation. He stumbled away from the console and collapsed into a nearby chair, his face in his hands. The sounds he made were the choked, broken sobs of a man whose entire reality had been annihilated. He had spent a decade ringing a dinner bell, believing he was lighting a candle for his lost love. I felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. I backed away from the machine, which now seemed monstrously malevolent in its quiet state, and helped the old weeping man to his feet. Let's go downstairs, I said softly. We made our way out of the lab, Alistair sealing the heavy vault door behind us with a final, mournful clunk. We went down to his kitchen, the one that was frozen in 1980. He sank down at the small formica table while I filled a glass with water from the tap, the mundane sound of it an absurd counterpoint to the cosmic horror we had just confronted. He finally looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. I thought the whispers were her, just weak from the distance, he said, his voice raspy with grief. I thought the other sounds, the clicking and worse, were just interference. Noise from an unstable connection. He shook his head, a look of self-loathing on his face. But the noise was the message. She was whispering so it wouldn't hear her. The clicking, that was it. Getting closer. Every time I turned on the machine, I was leading it right to her. A horrifying thought occurred to me. When it said my name, I began. Alistair nodded grimly. It learned it from you. From your thoughts. The aperture is a window for more than just sound. It reads the energy of the observer. It was using your own mind as a weapon against you. Using Eleanor's voice as a lure for me. We sat in silence for a long time, the ticking of a clock on the wall counting out the seconds of our new, terrible reality. The mission was no longer about rescue. It was about quarantine. We have to destroy it, I said finally. Unplug it, take an axe to it, whatever it takes. It's not that simple, Alistair said wearily. The repair you made, it worked too well. It created a stable resonance bridge. The connection is stronger, more efficient than ever before. If we just cut the power, the energy field could collapse inward catastrophically. It might rupture completely. I can't predict what would happen. It could do nothing, or it could take the whole block with it. He rubbed his tired eyes. There is a way. A controlled shutdown sequence. It would use the machine's own energy field to fold in on itself, sealing the aperture permanently. But it's a complex procedure. We would have to turn it on one last time. One last time. The thought of willingly opening that door again, knowing what was waiting on the other side, made me physically ill. But what choice did we have? As we sat there, two exhausted men contemplating an impossible task, the house gave a sudden violent shudder, rattling the dishes in the cupboards. The lights in the kitchen didn't just flicker, they dimmed to that sick, pale violet for 3 long seconds before returning to normal. My eyes met Alistair's, a new, immediate panic rising in me. That had never happened when the machine was off. And then we heard it. It came from upstairs. From the 2nd floor. A single, distinct, and unambiguous sound that cut through the silence of the house. It was the sound of something heavy and sharp scraping against metal. It was coming from the other side of the vault door. Scrape. Drag. Scrape. The thing was no longer just a voice on the other side of a temporary window. The stable bridge we had built had given it a foothold. It was here. It was testing the bars of its cage from the inside. And we were the ones who had just handed it the key. It was one sound, 3 times. Scrape. Drag. Scrape. But it was enough to shatter the world. The mundane reality of the quiet kitchen evaporated, leaving behind a cold, primal fear. The monster wasn't in another dimension anymore, waiting to be called. A part of it was already here, locked in the room above our heads, testing the strength of its cage. My first instinct was to run. I pushed my chair back, a frantic animal need for self-preservation screaming at me to get out of the house, to get as far away as possible. "Don't," Alistair said, his voice a low, steady command that cut through my panic. He hadn't moved. He was staring at the ceiling, his scientific mind already working, analyzing the new, terrifying data. Running won't help. If that door fails, it won't matter if we're in this house or yours. How is that possible? I demanded, my voice trembling. The machine is off. You said the aperture was closed. It is, he said, turning his pale, terrified eyes to me. But the repair we made, the stability of the connection, it was too perfect. When we shut it down, the bridge didn't fully retract. It left a residue, a trace connection. The door is closed, but the doorway is still there, resonating at a quantum level. It's like a ghost of the connection, and that thing, it can feel it. It can push against it. The house shuddered again, a low groan that seemed to come from its very foundations. This was its doing. The creature's presence was warping the fabric of our reality on a small, localized scale. Alistair's face hardened with a grim resolve. The plan has changed. Or rather, the timetable has. We can't wait. We don't know how strong that door is, or what the constant pressure from the other side might do to it. We have to perform the shutdown sequence. Tonight. Now. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. A few hours ago, I was a graphic designer. Now I was preparing to do battle with a dimensional entity. The next hour was a blur of frantic, purposeful activity. There was no more time for grief or hesitation. Alistair was back in his element, a general preparing his battlefield. The primary risk is the creature interfering with the shutdown sequence itself, he explained as he pulled dusty electronic components from old storage boxes. Its energy field could overload the console at the critical moment. We need to shield it. We ran heavy-duty cables from a grounding rod outside the house into the lab, creating a makeshift Faraday cage around the control console. It was a desperate, improvised defense against a force he barely understood. My job was to follow his instructions, my fear replaced by a numb, focused sense of purpose. "I'm setting up a remote monitor," he said, grabbing a laptop and a long Ethernet cable. "A security camera in the hallway, aimed at the vault door. We can watch it from the kitchen. See what we're dealing with before we go in." He disappeared upstairs. I was left alone in the kitchen, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I listened, straining to hear another scrape, another sign of the creature's presence. There was nothing. The silence was almost worse. A few minutes later, Alistair returned and set the laptop on the kitchen table. He typed a few commands, and a grainy, black and white image flickered to life. It was a live feed of the upstairs hallway. The bookshelf was swung open, revealing the heavy, impassive face of the steel vault door. It was still. Silent. Now we wait, Alistair said, his voice low. We need to understand its behavior. If it has periods of activity and dormancy. He was cut off by a sound from the laptop speakers. It was the scraping, but it was different now. It was faster, more frantic, more angry, and it was joined by a new sound. A dull, heavy thud. My eyes were glued to the screen. Thud. On the grainy feed, I saw the impossible. The thick steel of the vault door visibly bulged outward for a split second, the metal groaning in protest. Thud. It happened again, a dent appearing on the flat surface of the door. The creature was no longer scratching at the lock. It was trying to smash its way through with pure, brute force. The hinges of the bookshelf screeched, straining against the weight. Alistair stared at the screen, his face a mask of horror. All the planning, the hope for a controlled strategic approach, vanished in the face of that raw, physical violence. The door was not going to hold. We weren't on our own timetable anymore. We were on the creature's. He looked from the bulging door on the screen to me, his expression stripped of all scientific detachment, leaving only a grim, terrible determination. It's now or never, Ethan, he said, his voice barely a whisper. We have to go up there now. There was no time for a second thought. Alistair's words, it's now or never, echoed in the shaking frame of the house. We were no longer strategists. We were soldiers in a desperate, last-ditch counteroffensive. We moved in sync, a grim, two-man army against the unknown. We didn't need to speak. The plan, insane as it was set. I grabbed the heavy insulated gloves from the kitchen counter while Alistair took a final, steadying look at the laptop screen, where the image of the vault door shuddered with another violent impact. The journey up the stairs was a journey into hell. The rhythmic thud from above was no longer a muffled sound. It was a physical force that vibrated through the floorboards and up my spine. With each step, the impacts grew louder, the shaking more violent. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and a framed picture of Eleanor rattled on the wall, threatening to fall. The creature knew we were coming. We reached the upstairs hallway. The sight was even worse than it had been on the monitor. The entire bookshelf, heavy with books and reinforced steel, was visibly shaking. The thick vault door was dented and warped, a deep groove now visible where it was being repeatedly struck. Alistair met my eyes, his face a pale mask of grim determination. He strode forward and placed his hand on the heavy wheel of the vault door. The moment his hand touched the metal, the battering stopped. A sudden, profound silence fell over the hallway. It was more terrifying than the noise. The creature was on the other side of that door, just inches away. And it was listening. It was waiting. There's no turning back now, Alistair whispered. He spun the wheel, the tumblers disengaging with a series of loud clicks that sounded like gunshots in the stillness. He pulled the massive door open, and we stepped inside, into the belly of the beast. The air in the lab was thick and cold, charged with a palpable, malevolent energy. The usual latent hum of the machine was still there, but beneath it was a new feeling, the suffocating pressure of an intelligent, hostile presence. To your station, Ethan, Alistair commanded, his voice sharp, cutting through the fear. He scrambled to the control console, which was already sparking faintly from the energy bleeding into the room. I ran to the side of the machine where a large, spring-loaded breaker handle was set into the wall, a manual override for the power flow. You must hold that down for the entire sequence, he shouted over his shoulder. If you let go, the field will collapse. Do you understand? I understand. I yelled back, grabbing the handle with both gloved hands and forcing it down with all my weight. It resisted, vibrating with a low, angry energy. Alistair's fingers flew across his console. Initializing power-up for emergency shutdown. Bypassing primary safeties. God help us, Eleanor. The machine roared to life, the noise 100 times more violent than before. The aperture at the center of the ring ripped open, the black, light-devouring hole fringed with a furious violet corona. And the voice screamed. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was Eleanor's voice, amplified and twisted into a shriek of pure terror. Alistair, you fool. You're letting it in. It lied to me. It's wearing my voice to trick you. Alistair cried out, his hands faltering on the keyboard as the raw, terrified voice of his wife clawed at him. Alistair, don't listen. I screamed, struggling to hold the breaker, which was now shaking so violently it felt like it would rip my arms from their sockets. It's a trick. The console in front of Alistair exploded in a shower of sparks, the shielding we'd installed glowing red hot. The lights in the lab flickered and died, plunging us into a terrifying twilight lit only by the violent purple glow of the aperture. From the hole, the guttural roar of the creature itself joined Eleanor's screams, a sound of pure cosmic rage. "The console is failing," Alistair yelled. "I have to enter the final command now. Hold on." He typed, his face illuminated by the dying monitor, a frantic prayer of code and numbers. The breaker in my hands felt like a living thing, trying to throw me off. I felt the creature's will, its immense, hateful pressure, focused entirely on me, on this one physical link it could try to break. "It's coming," Eleanor's voice shrieked. "I'm in," Alistair roared, and slammed his palm down on a large red button. For one silent, eternal second, nothing happened. Then, the roar of the machine inverted, becoming a single, impossibly high-pitched tone that vibrated in the very atoms of my bones. The blackness of the aperture did not close, it flashed. A wave of brilliant, silent, white light expanded from the machine, completely engulfing the room. I felt a tremendous crushing pressure, saw a universe of stars born and die behind my eyelids, and then there was only the white, endless light. And then, darkness. And silence. I coughed, my lungs aching. I was on the floor, my ears ringing. The room was pitch black and utterly still. The humming, the roaring, the screaming, all of it was gone. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. A faint, acrid smell of ozone and something else, like cold, damp stone, lingered in the air. "Alistair!" I croaked, pushing myself up. A beam of light cut through the darkness. It was Alistair, holding a small flashlight. He was slumped against the console, exhausted and bruised, but alive. "It's done," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The bridge is sealed." I stumbled to my feet and looked at the machine. It was dark, silent, and dead. I looked at the phantom window. The eerie glow was gone. The glass was spiderwebbed with cracks, but it was just a window. The oppressive, malevolent presence that had filled the room was gone. It was over. We helped each other out of the silent, tomb-like lab, and Alistair sealed the heavy vault door for the last time. As we stood in the hallway, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock downstairs. The house was quiet. The war was over. Days later, life had begun its slow, awkward return to something resembling normal. Alistair was recovering, a quiet, haunted man who had finally found a bitter peace. The house next door was just a house. But as I sat in my office, trying to work, I knew that for me, the quiet would never be the same. My gaze drifted to the dead patch of grass in my yard, a permanent scar on the landscape. I looked up at the phantom window. The sun was glinting off the newly cracked glass. And for just a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of movement behind it. A dark shape, a shadow, there and then gone. A trick of the light. A phantom on my own tired retina. It had to be. The door was closed. But a terrifying, new quiet had settled into my life. The quiet of a man who listens for a scratch on the other side of the wall, and knows, with a certainty that will never leave him, that he will be listening for the rest of his life. The summer of fear bled into a quiet, haunted autumn. 2 months had passed since the night of the white light. The world, stubbornly, had failed to end. The neighbors raked their leaves into orange piles, the mailman continued his route with cheerful indifference, and the suburbs settled into the comfortable, sleepy rhythm of the changing seasons. On the surface, everything was normal. But I was living in a different reality. My life was now divided into 2 distinct eras, before the machine and after. In the after, the quiet was the loudest sound I knew. I still worked from home, but my office window no longer felt like a portal to the outside world. It felt like a guard post. The habit of watching Alistair's house was too deeply ingrained to stop. I would find myself staring at the phantom window, my coffee growing cold in my hand, my eyes searching for a flicker of movement that I both dreaded and, on some level, expected. The trauma had left its ghosts. In the dead of night, I would hear a faint scraping sound and my heart would seize, only to realize it was the branch of the maple tree brushing against my siding. I would see a flicker in my peripheral vision and spin around, but it was only a reflection, a trick of the light. I was a sentry at an abandoned post, forever watching for an enemy that had already been defeated. Alistair and I had a new routine. Every Thursday afternoon, he would walk over, not to my front door, but to my back patio. I would make tea, and we would sit in the cool, autumn air. We were 2 veterans of a secret, impossible war, and we were the only members of our support group. We never spoke of the machine, or the aperture, or of Eleanor. We spoke of the weather, of the books he was reading, of the troublesome squirrels in his attic. The real, terrifying truth of our shared experience was a permanent, silent third guest at our table. One Thursday, I broke the unspoken rule. "I still see things," I confessed, my voice low, as I stared at the side of his house. "In the window. Just a flicker. A shadow. I know it's not real, but I see it." Alistair slowly stirred his tea, his gaze soft with a weary understanding. "When you stare into the abyss for so long, Ethan," he said gently, "sometimes you think you see it staring back, even after it's gone. The readings are zero. The EMF is gone. The bridge is sealed. What you're experiencing is the echo of trauma. It will fade." For him, it truly was over. He had honored Eleanor's last, terrifying wish. He had closed the door. The 40-year weight on his soul had been lifted, replaced by the heavy but clean finality of grief. He had found his peace. I, on the other hand, had lost mine. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. I tried to dismiss the flickers of movement as my own traumatized mind playing tricks. I tried to convince myself the faint sounds were just an old house settling. But I couldn't explain away the dead patch of grass. It was the one remaining physical scar of the ordeal, a pale, silvery brown crescent in my lawn where the machine's energy had bled into the soil. I had expected the healthy grass to slowly reclaim it, or for weeds to take root. But it remained stubbornly, unnaturally barren. Until last week. I had been washing dishes, looking out the kitchen window, when my eyes drifted to it. In the very center of the dead zone, there was a tiny speck of white. Curious, I had gone outside to investigate. It was a small, pale sprout, no bigger than my thumbnail. Now, a week later, it had grown. I stood before it, the autumn air cold on my skin, and stared. It was a flower, but like nothing I had ever seen. It had a single, thick, waxy stem, and its petals were a pale, translucent white, tinged with the faintest hint of the violet light from the aperture. The shape of it was wrong. The 5 petals were too perfect, their edges too sharp, meeting in crystalline, geometric angles. It didn't look like it was growing from the soil, but rather, through it, like a glitch in a photograph, an object that didn't belong. It seemed to drink the autumn light, reflecting nothing. My conversation with Alistair replayed in my mind. The echo of trauma. But this was not an echo. This was not a memory. This was a physical object. This was proof. Alistair had closed the bridge. He had sealed the door. But something, in that final silent flash of white light, had crossed over. It wasn't a monster of tooth and claw that had been left behind. It was a seed, and it had found fertile ground in the poisoned earth of my own backyard. For weeks, I had been battling the ghosts in my own mind. The flickers of shadow, the phantom sounds. I had allowed Alistair's logic to convince me they were simply echoes of trauma, the scars left behind by a war that was already won. But this was no ghost. This was a physical thing, a violation of biology, growing in my yard. This was proof. My hands shook as I took a dozen photos with my phone, capturing the flower from every conceivable angle. The crystalline structure of the petals, the unnatural violet tint, the way it seemed to defy the very nature of a plant. Then, without a second thought, I marched across my lawn, around the fence, and knocked. No, banged, on Alistair Finch's front door. He opened it, a look of mild surprise on his face, ready for our now customary Thursday tea. The look faded to concern as he saw the frantic, wild expression in my eyes. "Alistair, you have to see this," I said, my voice tight. I held up my phone. He took it, his brow furrowed. "Ethan, we've discussed this. The mind can conjure. This isn't in my mind." I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "This is in my yard. Look." He fell silent as he swiped through the photos. I watched his face, the scientist within him taking over. He zoomed in on the geometric edges of the petals, his eyes narrowing. The color drained from his face. He handed the phone back to me. "Take me to it," he said, his voice a grim whisper. I led him to the dead patch of earth. He knelt down beside the alien flower, his old knees cracking. He didn't touch it. He just observed, his gaze sweeping over its impossible form. He saw what I saw, the way it seemed to absorb the light, the waxy, non-biological texture of its stem, its perfect, symmetrical wrongness. He saw its location, sprouted from the very heart of the ground his machine had poisoned. "It's a mutation," he said, though his voice lacked any conviction. "A local fungus, altered by the residual energy." "Do you believe that?" I asked quietly. He was silent for a long time. Finally, he shook his head, a single, defeated gesture. "No," he admitted, his voice cracking. "The energy signature of the shutdown was unique. It wasn't radiation in the traditional sense. It wouldn't cause a mutation like this. This is an introduction. A xenobiological entity. His hard-won peace was shattered. The weary calm he had cultivated for 2 months was gone, replaced by the old, familiar look of a scientist confronting a terrifying, unknown variable. The final energy wave of the shutdown. He murmured, thinking aloud. It must have carried something across. Not matter in the conventional sense. A seed. A spore. And the energy that killed your grass. It must have made the soil hospitable for it. Primed it. So what do we do? I asked, looking at the solitary alien thing. Do we burn it? Dig it up? No, he said sharply, a new urgency in his voice. We know nothing about its biology. Burning it could release spores. Its root system could be microscopic, impossible to contain if we disturb the soil. We can't act until we know more. For now, we contain it. We spent the rest of the afternoon building a makeshift containment unit. We constructed a small, cube-like frame out of wood and completely draped it in thick, heavy-duty plastic sheeting, weighing down the edges with bricks and sealing the seams with tape. It was a crude, absurd-looking tent in the middle of my yard, another secret for the neighbors to wonder about. As we worked, a grim, silent understanding passed between us. Our war wasn't over. It had just entered a new, insidious, biological phase. As dusk fell, we stood in my kitchen, looking out the window at our handiwork. The plastic cube was a strange, translucent monument to our fear. And as the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, something happened. A soft, ethereal glow began to emanate from within the tent. It was the flower. In the absence of sunlight, it was producing its own. It was a faint, pulsing, biological light, the exact same pale, ghostly violet as the aperture. A cold dread washed over me. I grabbed the parabolic microphone, the tool I had thought I would never need again. I ran to the back door, aimed the dish at the glowing tent, and put on the headphones. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. But then, as I strained to listen, I heard it. It was not a voice. It was not a scrape or a click. It was a sound so faint it was almost imperceptible, a soft, high-frequency chiming. It was rhythmic, a steady, repeating pulse, a complex pattern of tones and silences. My blood ran cold. I looked at Alistair, who was standing beside me, his face a pale silhouette against the glowing tent. I pulled the headphones from my ears. It's not just growing, I said, my voice trembling. It's doing something else. He knew. The scientist in him, the man who understood signals and frequencies, had already come to the same horrifying conclusion. It's a beacon, Alistair whispered, his eyes wide with a new, dawning terror. It's not just a plant. It's a transmitter. It's calling home. The flower wasn't just a remnant. It was an embassy. A silent, glowing ambassador for a world of darkness, and its message was being broadcast from the heart of my own lawn. The quiet, psychological horror I had been living with for 2 months had just been replaced by a clear, active, and escalating threat. We stumbled back into Alistair's kitchen, the pulsating violet light of the plant painting eerie, dancing shadows through the window. My mind was a frantic mess of brute force solutions. We have to destroy it, Alistair, I said, my voice tight with urgency. Right now. Gasoline, a blowtorch, I don't care. We have to burn it out of the ground. And if that's what it wants, he countered, his voice a low, fearful rasp. He began pacing the small kitchen, his mind racing. Think, Ethan. This is not a terrestrial biology. What if its seeds are microscopic spores that are only released upon the destruction of the host plant? We could turn your yard into a field of them. We could inhale them. We can't act with brute force. We're dealing with a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. So we just let it sit out there and call for its friends? I shot back, gesturing wildly at the glowing cube in my yard. No, he said, stopping his pacing. He looked from the window to the ceiling, towards the lab. A look of profound reluctance and dread crossed his face. We can't destroy the beacon, but perhaps we can blind it. We can build a cage around the signal itself. A Faraday cage? I asked. We already put it in a plastic tent. Infinitely more complex than that, he said, shaking his head. A standard cage blocks standard electromagnetic frequencies. This beacon isn't broadcasting radio waves. It's a trans-dimensional resonance signal. To block it, you need to create a localized, chaotic field of the same unique frequency. You have to fight noise with noise. A cold, heavy dread began to settle in my stomach. I knew where this was going. How do we do that? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Alistair's eyes met mine, and they were filled with the terrified look of a man about to suggest the unthinkable. The only way, he said, his voice barely a whisper, is to use the machine. The idea was monstrous. To go back into that room, to willingly wake the sleeping beast that we had risked our lives to put down. It felt like a betrayal, a desecration. No, I said, a gut reaction. Absolutely not. We can't. We have to, he insisted, his voice gaining a desperate strength. We don't need to open the aperture. We don't need to build the bridge. But the core power systems, the resonance coils, they are the only things on this planet capable of generating the specific counter-frequency needed to jam that signal. The only poison that can fight this venom comes from the snake itself. He was right. I knew he was right. The sheer, insane logic of it was undeniable. The next day was a surreal journey back into a life I thought I had left behind. Alistair, after hours of frantic calculations, drew up a list. He sent me to a specialty electronic supplier an hour away with a page of components that sounded like pure science fiction: a liquid-cooled piezoelectric transducer, a grade 5 neodymium flux channel, 3 spools of silver-plated copper shielding wire. I stood in the brightly lit, normal store, listening to other customers debate the merits of different audio cables, while I purchased the parts to build a dimensional prison in my backyard. That evening, we stood before the vault door once more. The air in the upstairs hallway felt heavy, stale. Alistair took a deep breath, his hand on the wheel. What we did before was about closing a chapter, he said grimly. What we are about to do is to reopen it and try to write the ending ourselves. There are no guarantees. He opened the door. The lab was just as we had left it, dark, silent, and cold. It felt like a tomb. But tonight, we were here not as warriors, but as engineers, attempting one of the most dangerous renovations in human history. The plan was to cannibalize a secondary power conduit from the machine and use the new components to build a portable, self-contained jamming device. To do that, the lab needed power. Alistair walked over to the wall by the door, where a massive, industrial-sized breaker box was installed. This was the main cutoff, the switch that isolated the entire lab from the city's power grid. He placed his hand on the large, black lever. He had thrown this switch to the off position 2 months ago, believing it would be the last time. He looked at me, the weight of our decision, of our entire shared, secret history, in his tired eyes. There will be no turning back from this, Ethan, he said. Are you certain? I thought of the thing in my yard, pulsing its silent, alien message into the cosmos. I thought of Eleanor's final, terrified warning. We had no choice. I gave him a single, grim nod. He took a deep breath, his knuckles white around the lever, and threw the switch. And in the oppressive tomb-like silence of the lab, a low, familiar hum began to stir, like a monster clearing its throat. The hum of the resurrected machine was the soundtrack to our desperate, frantic work. It was a low, menacing thrum that vibrated through the floor, a constant reminder of the power we were attempting to tame. This was not a controlled, scientific procedure like the ones before. This was a frantic, battlefield surgery, and the patient, the operating table, and the deadly disease were all the same monstrous entity. Alistair was a man transformed. His grief and fear were burned away, leaving behind the pure, focused essence of the brilliant scientist he had once been. He was the surgeon, and I was his nurse, his steady hand. Ethan, I need the transducer, he would command, and I would pass it to him. Connect that conduit to the secondary coil. Watch the amperage. We were dismantling his life's work. We were taking apart the machine he had spent 40 years building, the monument to his lost love, and cannibalizing its sacred parts for a new, desperate purpose. Every wire I cut, every bolt I loosened, felt like a final, painful act of letting go on his behalf. We were not just building a new device, we were tearing down the old one, piece by painful piece. As we worked, a small monitor on the console displayed the signal from the beacon. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse. A constant, patient call into the void. We were nearly finished. Alistair was soldering the final connection on the strange, cage-like device we had constructed, a web of copper wire, crystal lenses, and humming capacitors. The power draw is about to peak, he warned. Hold steady. As he spoke, the hum from the main machine behind us suddenly intensified. The lights in the lab flickered violently. On the monitor, the beacon signal, which had been a steady pulse, suddenly spiked, its waveform contorting into a frantic, high-energy scream. It knows. Alistair yelled over the noise. The power surge is creating a resonance echo. It's using the energy to send a stronger signal. It's shouting now, Ethan. We're out of time. A frantic energy seized us. We finished the last connection, and the small jamming device in the center of the room began to glow with its own low, blue light. "It's ready," Alistair shouted. "We have to deploy it now." He grabbed the device, which was surprisingly heavy, and I took the thick, insulated power cable. We ran from the lab, down the stairs, and out my back door into the cool night. The containment tent in my yard was no longer glowing with a soft, violet pulse. It was flashing, a frantic, brilliant strobe of light, a lighthouse for unimaginable horrors. We placed the humming jammer directly over the tent, a cage lowered upon a cage. I connected the power cable. "It's ready," I yelled to Alistair, who had run back to his front door. "Get back," he commanded. I sprinted away from the device, stopping at the edge of my patio. Through his open door, I could see Alistair at the foot of his stairs, a phone to his ear, connected to the lab's console. "Activating the containment field, now," he shouted. The jamming device on my lawn hummed, the blue light brightening. A visible shimmer, like a sphere of distorted heat, expanded from it, completely enveloping the plastic tent. The frantic violet strobing from the flower within flickered, fought against the blue field for a moment, and then, with a final pathetic pulse, was completely snuffed out. The signal was gone. The beacon was blind. A profound silence fell over the yard. Alistair emerged from his house, his shoulders slumped with an exhaustion so deep it seemed to age him another 20 years right before my eyes. We stood there on our separate lawns, two survivors on the quiet battlefield, and looked at the strange humming monument to our victory. We had done it. 1 year later, the world was quiet. The hum of the jamming device in my backyard had become a normal part of my life soundscape, a gentle, electronic cricket that chirped day and night. It was a permanent fixture, a small, strange shrine I had to carefully mow around. It was my new normal. Alistair had found his peace. In the months that followed, we had dismantled the rest of the machine. The great copper coil, the crystal lenses, the banks of capacitors, all of it was taken apart, its power drained, its purpose erased. The secret room was now just a room, filled with boxes of old books and memories of a life before the obsession. He had finally let Eleanor go, honoring her memory by honoring her warning. Our weekly meetings continued, but they were no longer the tense, somber affairs of two co-conspirators. They were the easy, comfortable silences of two friends. This evening, we were sitting on my back patio, watching the sunset. The blue light of the jammer was just beginning to become visible in the twilight. It was peaceful. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, constant vigilance that had become a part of who I was. I was a guardian of a secret I could never share. Alistair raised the glass of iced tea I had poured for him. "To quiet neighbors," he said, and for the first time in all the years I had known him, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. I raised my glass in return. "To quiet neighbors," I repeated. I looked at the house next door, at the now innocuous phantom window, and then at the humming cage in my yard. The story that had started with a secret room had ended here, in the fading light of a peaceful evening. The door to that other world was closed, and I was the one who stood watch. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I could finally rest.